Welcome to Friend or Foe, the series where we pick apart the characters from some of our favorite games to figure out who is a friend, someone we don't need to worry will stab us in the back, and who is a foe, someone who would intentionally bring harm to the group if given the chance. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're sailing on the Ship of Theseus with Nick Valentine from Fallout 4. As always, you can find a link in the description to a playlist for this series for those long nights where you just want to sit back, relax, and listen to a bunch of breakdowns all at once. The question about who Nick Valentine is can't be easily answered, and even he isn't really sure about who he is when it comes down to it. We first meet him in the ruins of what was supposed to be Vault 114 after stopping by his office in Diamond City and hearing from his assistant Ellie that he's gone missing. The player character needs his help because at that moment, the one thing we do know for sure about Nick is that he's a detective who helps people find missing friends and relatives, and we're searching for our son Sean. But Nick isn't just any old detective. He is a synth detective that started his life as one of the early prototype synths built by the Institute. After finding a home in Diamond City, he started taking up cases from locals and heading out to search for loved ones they thought were lost forever. He wasn't always successful, not even the very best detectives can find what they're looking for 100% of the time, but he did a decent job, and his services were known Commonwealth-wide. In fact, the first time we meet him, he's on the trail of a missing girl who had apparently run away from home. And after sorting out the final details from that case, he's more than happy to help the player out as well. But we can't really get too far into his story without going back to before he was even built. See, the Nick Valentine we meet in Vault 114 isn't the real Nick Valentine. Back before the bombs dropped and ended the world in 2077, there was a detective in the greater Boston area known as Nick Valentine. Nick was a solid detective, and he'd been on plenty of cases over the course of his career. But in the mid-2070s, he would find himself working on a case involving organized crime that would turn his world upside down. A mob boss named Eddie Winter had been running the biggest crime family in Boston for years, and no one had been able to pin enough evidence on him to bring him down. He'd been running operations that involved him in several robberies and murders, and it was rumored that he carried out the whole thing from a sub shop that he owned in South Boston. As a last-ditch effort to try and find some kind of evidence on him, the Boston Police Department started a task force called Operation Winter's End. And they charged several investigators, including Nick Valentine, with doing whatever it took to implicate Eddie Winter in as many crimes as possible and finally bring an end to his reign of terror. Valentine was hot on the trail of Winter, and the task force had been able to collect a mountain of evidence on him when the whole thing came crashing down. The first big thing to happen was the murder of Nick's fiancée, Jennifer Lands, who was taken out by Winter as a means of sending a message to Nick that he wouldn't be able to miss. This was devastating to the detective, but his grief would have only driven him harder to take Winter down if not for a deal that was cut between Eddie Winter and an organization known as the Bureau of Alcohol, Drugs, Tobacco, Firearms, and Lasers, or BAD TFL. And this deal was one for the books, as it involved Eddie Winter making a series of holotapes that would implicate all his known associates for their roles in various crimes and grant him full immunity from prosecution. It was also a little underhanded, as they were planning to pretend he made the tapes of his own volition before being arrested so they could use them as evidence in other criminal cases. Now, on the one hand, there have been many cases involving the mob in real life where one person or another turns state's evidence against their former associates in order to get a lighter sentence or even to get off mostly scot-free. This kind of thing makes some sense, though it does come with risk because people may lie or stretch the truth if they see it as in their best interest. And those deals involve needing a lot of corroborating evidence to work out properly. It's helpful in cases where authorities are interested in bringing down larger organizations and stopping worse crimes from happening in the future, but it also means that some people basically get away with their crimes, and that can be frustrating to any of the victims of those crimes or their families. But Eddie Winter's case is unique in that he would be confessing in a way that implicated several other people without needing as much extra evidence, because it wouldn't look outwardly as if he'd made the tapes to save his own skin. The appearance to a jury would be that the tapes were collected after he'd been arrested, and that would change the way they were viewed, because if you think that someone confessed to a crime of their own volition, instead of just trying to get some kind of deal, you are more likely to believe it. Basically, Eddie Winter could make up a bunch of stuff that implicated other people as a way to walk free without anyone outside of the bad TFL knowing or being able to consider that possibility when it came time to go after the people he implicated. This is all important because in this immunity deal, Winter also gained immunity from prosecution for the murder of Jennifer Lands, meaning there would never be any justice for her, and Nick would have to live with the fact that the man who murdered his fiancée was walking free somewhere, and there was nothing that he could do about it. As if things couldn't get any worse, Winter built himself a bunker under his sub-shop and became part of an experiment that ostensibly made him the first ghoul and extended his life well beyond what it might have been naturally. He lived through the end of the world, hiding out as the bombs destroyed everything above ground and killed people like Nick Valentine. But Nick lived on in a way thanks to the scientists at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. He was ordered to go there by his boss, Captain Widmark, as they supposedly had some kind of new program dealing with brainwaves and trauma, and the hope was that whatever they had would help him move past the stress of the Winter case and losing Jennifer. But whatever help he might have gotten from the program was overshadowed by its true purpose, as the scientists at the CIT actually captured the essence of who Nick was, his thoughts, feelings, and core personality on their hard drives and stored them for future use. There's no way to know if they attained his consent to do this, but given what we know about the CIT and later the Institute from the Wasteland, it's likely they lied to him about the whole thing. The human version of Nick would die when the bombs dropped, or perhaps shortly thereafter, as we have no record of his life after his visit to the CIT. But over a century later, Nick would come back to life in the form of another experiment, and in a way, he would become a living version of the Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is a thought experiment that focuses on when something ceases to be one thing and becomes another. It centers around a ship that Theseus, the mythical king of Athens from the legends of Greece written by Plutarch, sailed on after defeating the Minotaur of King Minos on Crete. The ship would become a legend in its own right, being sailed annually in honor of the god Apollo, and would gain more notoriety when philosophers started to ask questions about the ship and the pieces being used to fix it over time. See, planks would rot and go bad over the years, and would be replaced when they did. But that raised the question of when the ship ceased to be the same vessel that Theseus had used and became a new ship entirely. If you replace a single plank, it's still pretty obviously the same ship. But what about when you've replaced 20% of the planks, or 50%, or 90%? At what point, if any, is the ship considered to be different enough to make it a brand new ship? And this whole thing gets a little more complicated when you wonder, as 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes did, what the situation would be if you kept all of the boards that were being replaced and used them to eventually rebuild the ship. Which ship would be the original? There's no one right answer here, but bringing us back to Nick Valentine, we have to consider the idea of human consciousness and what makes us who we are. On the surface, you might consider yourself a sum of your parts. Your body with all its inner and outer workings and your mind would combine to equal the real you. But then we run into a problem that runs in line with the Ship of Theseus, as we begin to consider what might happen when pieces started to be replaced. For instance, we have artificial limbs for people who have lost an arm or a leg, and we even have and are developing implants that can help replace parts of the body like the ears and the eyes. There are dental implants and hair plugs as well. So in theory, you could be more machine and artificial than human from that aspect if you really worked at it. We can't yet transplant heads from one body to another, though researchers have tried that in the past. And while we aren't yet able to transfer the information stored in the brain to a computer, that is being worked on as well. And that last thing is where we meet up with Nick Valentine, as the scientists at the CIT were able to do just that, and we're left with the question of which Nick is the real one. If you're able to transfer your consciousness to a computer and either load it onto a new body or even just have it exist as a machine version of yourself, there would, for all intents and purposes, be two of you. At the moment of transfer, or actually making a copy, there is the version of you in your body that has all of the experiences and thoughts that make you, you. And there is a version on the computer that has those same experiences and thoughts. If the you that lives in your body then dies, but the you on the computer goes on, does that mean that you are still alive? At what point do you cease being you and become someone new? We know that alterations to specific parts of the brain can completely change a person's personality. Someone who is mild-mannered and loves reading and relaxing on the beach can become an ill-tempered person who wants nothing more than to join a motorcycle gang and get tattoos all over their body with just a small change to their brain after an accident. Something like that happened to a man named Phineas Gage in 1848 when he had a railroad spike driven through his head during an explosion, changing his personality so much that longtime friends even said he was a completely different person after the accident. So coming full circle and bringing it back to the Ship of Theseus, if your brain and its physical makeup determine who you are, then we have to focus on that part when considering when someone becomes a new person. If you could replace the brain completely, but load all of the memories, thoughts, ideas, feelings, and experiences from the old one onto the new one, would you be a new person or the same person with a new brain? This is the problem that Nick has, as he has all of the thoughts, feelings, memories, personality, and experiences of the human version of himself while being trapped in the body of an early generation synth built by the Institute. The moment the information stored in the brain went digital, there were technically two Nicks for a short time, with one of them being killed around the time the bombs fell and the other being preserved at the CIT. In the end, there isn't any one right or best answer, but it's an identity crisis Nick has to deal with even early on as we move into his earliest days in the Commonwealth and beyond. Sometime in the early 2100s, a group of scientists from the CIT managed to carve out a space below their old workplace and begin experimenting with ways to bring humanity back from the brink of extinction. They didn't know much at the time about what the world was like above them, but they knew that it would need some help coming back after humans tried their best to kill off all life on the planet. Getting past the basic survival stage, they started to really thrive and turn their attention to making advancements in areas like biology, chemistry, and robotics, with a focus on robotics including not only building machines to help mankind, but to maybe even eventually change the species completely. As part of that endeavor, they started what would become the Synth program. Early synths were basic robots that could be controlled rather easily and ordered around to do basic tasks, but over time they would begin creating new models that had the capability to think for themselves and show signs of artificial general intelligence. One of those early synths would wind up becoming Nick Valentine. The researchers had managed to create a synth that could process feelings and emotions, but they wanted to see how things would go if they uploaded a personality to one. Nick's mind scan was still on the old CIT databases, so it became the focus of the experiments. And while there were a number of hiccups along the way, they were eventually able to make it work. At some point, after years of being tested on and toyed with, Nick would escape from the Institute with another synth named Dima. The two were the only synths from that particular test generation, and Dima considered Nick a brother, though Nick didn't return the feeling as he fought the reality of his situation. See, to Nick, he was still a human, and he hadn't fully processed the fact that his mind had, for all intents, been moved to a machine. It would take years for him to comprehend what was going on, and over time he would lose many of the earliest memories he had from the Institute and of Dima. Not many people were willing to talk to or associate with Nick due to his appearance, but he managed to get along fine for a while and wound up in Diamond City after saving the mayor's daughter by pretending to be a bomb and scaring off some raiders. Synths weren't really trusted in the Commonwealth overall, and a lot of people in the city were skeptical of him at first, but over time they would begin turning to him to help find missing people. After a while, he decided to open his own detective agency, and he managed to make a name for himself as a trusted PI all over the wasteland of Boston and beyond. His interaction with the sole survivor in Fallout 4 can be minimal, but the longer you spend with him and the more good you do, the more he grows to trust you. That trust will lead to him opening up about his past, and will eventually help close the 200-year-old cold case of Eddie Winter. Nick can open up to the player about his past, and after searching police precincts all over the city of Boston and locating all 10 of the holotapes Eddie Winter had recorded as part of his deal with the bad TFL, we have the chance to follow Nick to Eddie's hideout and confront the mob boss for his crimes. This can only go one way, and once Winter has been dealt with, Nick will find himself conflicted. He's happy in a way to have finally brought justice for all the people that Winter hurt, including Jennifer, but he's also unsure of what getting that revenge means for him moving forward. Getting rid of Eddie Winter means that all ties to the former life of Nick Valentine are gone from the world. From that point on out, everything he does is for himself rather than the other version of Nick. Talking through it, he does seem to realize too that the things that he's built since waking up for the first time in the post-bomb world are his and his alone, and he's done a lot to be proud of in his time as a synth. But that brings us to the main point of the video. Is Nick Valentine a friend or a foe? Nick's main focus is on doing the right thing and helping people as much as possible, and he's willing to sacrifice whatever it takes to see justice served or provide answers to families who've lost loved ones. He's not one to stab people in the back or to choose the easy path even when doing the right thing becomes difficult. Because of that, he is the easiest one in the series to date to categorize as a friend. There's honestly no real negatives to speak of for Nick. He's been through hell, both as a person and as a synth, and he still wants to do nothing but bring light to the dark world. He could have been very cold and calloused after everything he's been through, but he chooses to turn his pain into good deeds. And that's something that isn't really appreciated enough about Nick. Think of it this way. He, the human version, lost his fiancée to a horrific murder at the hands of someone he would find out not long after was actually untouchable. Winter killed Jennifer and then took a deal with an agency that was as crooked as could be. And while still grieving and dealing with that, Nick had his consciousness transferred to a machine without his knowledge. From there, the next thing he remembers is waking up in a garbage heap with no idea how much time had passed or what had happened after his visit to the CIT because he'd been basically stored on a hard drive for an unspecified amount of time. Every institution he trusted and relied on had let him down and lied to him. The love of his life had been killed, and he was in a world that looked at him with indifference at best and hate at worst. And yet, he pushed on and continued to try and do what he saw as right. Nick is the embodiment of what it means to be a friend in this series, and there isn't much more that can be said about him overall. At least not by me. I know you all have thoughts on Nick, and likely on whether the Nick that we meet in the game is the same Nick that worked as a detective in Boston before the bombs dropped, and I want to hear them in the comments below. There were things I didn't touch on in the video, like the situation with Kellogg and the implications that could have had, and I'd be happy to continue the discussion in the future if you want to comment about that as well. Could there be a second personality hiding below the surface of the Nick that we know? Would that mean that Kellogg lives on alongside the detective? If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up button and make sure you subscribe to Lost in Games on YouTube so you don't miss any future Friend or Foe episodes, and so you don't miss out on my other big series here on the channel, Philosophy and Ethics in Games, where we talk about the stories in games and expand on some of the topics like the Ship of Theseus that we discussed in this video and more. I've also got channel memberships, a Patreon, and a membership program on my website where you can sign up to get cool perks like having your name on the screen and behind-the-scenes exclusives while helping me to get more games to break down in the future and make bigger and better episodes of each and every series on the channel. That's all I've got for now. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.